I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing the evolution of cybersecurity regulation in the European Union. In particular, the EU is poised to adopt a comprehensive cybersecurity framework in the NIS2 set of regulations that will apply to critical infrastructure across the EU. Why does that matter? Well, that's an important question because we are starting to see in this regulation and others the continued evolution in the way that cybersecurity law works. I think listeners of this podcast would often see that cybersecurity regulation has been much more flexible than, say, data protection. You often have to include, reasonable safeguards, appropriate safeguards, and it gives much more flexibility to regulated entities. That is shifting. And in particular, it's shifting in important ways for industries that sit within specific sectors of concern or critical infrastructure. And that's really where we want to focus today's conversation. And in particular, what does this look like in connection with the NIS2 set of regulations? To discuss, I've invited one of my colleagues, Dan Whitehead, who's a counsel in our UK office. Dan's practice focuses on data protection, but in particular, he spends a lot of time working on cybersecurity issues for his clients. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
So Dan, maybe we can just start off by maybe with a big question. What is the NIS2 set of regulations? And from your perspective, why are they important?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as you've already explained, NIS2 is essentially a kind of overarching cybersecurity framework that the EU has created that's focused on protecting critical infrastructure, and particularly the operational resilience of what they consider to be critical infrastructure entities. I think taking a step back, so the reason it's called NIS2 is because it's a successor to NIS1, which actually is in force right now within the EU. And in some ways, it's not particularly well known as a piece of legislation, but NIS1 took effect around about the same time as the GDPR in 2018 and introduced a broad kind of overarching cybersecurity rules for certain sectors and domains. I think the criticism of that regulation has been that it's not been very successfully adopted within EU member states. The enforcement powers, as far as the EU were concerned, weren't sufficiently significant, nor was the enforcement action or the extent to which the obligations applied to organizations in order for it to be successful. So they've essentially reformed NIS1. It has a lot of similarities, but also supplemented it further with additional obligations, which I'm sure we'll discuss. But also just a kind of bigger picture point, which is, as you said, this is part of a wider set of cybersecurity regulations, but not just cybersecurity regulations, digital regulation, particularly in the EU, where the EU has kind of instigated over the last 4 or 5 years a torrent of new digital regulations across different areas of the digital economy. That includes everything from digital services and content moderation to digital markets and competition law, to the AI Act, which of course is having so much attention right now, to data governance rules with the Data Act, but also cybersecurity, which may get less attention, but actually there's a huge amount of work being done from a policy and legislative level in introducing new regulations there. NIS2 is one of them, but it's not the full picture. There's also, which we won't go into much detail on today, I don't think, but DORA, which regulates financial entities, and the Cyber Resilience Act, which is intended to regulate not infrastructure as such, but actually software and hardware devices.
Yeah, interesting. So you're describing kind of the framework here as being the NIS2 regs will replace the NIS1 regs, which had some limitations. Does this work the same way that, say, data protection laws work in the EU, that individual DPAs are in charge and entrusted of enforcing these set of regulations? Or is this a completely different set of regulators that are involved with these regs?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed picture. So I think, first of all, for those less familiar with how EU law works, NIS2 is a directive as opposed to a regulation. So the GDPR is ultimately a regulation which applies, at least in theory, generally speaking, at a harmonized level across the EU. So in other words, every EU member state has the same GDPR standards with some derogations. The difference, and it's very significant with NIS2, is that with it being a directive, is implemented or intended to be implemented by each member state separately. So the directive NIS2 does not apply directly to organizations per se, but instead implemented versions of the directive, which are currently being enacted in member states right now, will apply to organizations going forward. And that creates a degree of divergence as well in approach. So whereas the GDPR is broadly consistent across the EU, what we will see, I think, with NIS2 is there is some divergence, but also less ability, particularly for some entities, to rely on a one-stop shop or main establishment or lead supervisory authority, as it's often referred to under the GDPR. So you may find, depending on the sector, that if you're subject to this regulation or directive, you're subject to the competence of authorities in multiple different EU countries.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with respect to data protection, it's hard to be working with different frameworks and different standards, but even more so from a cybersecurity perspective, right? Typically, organizations, when they are looking to defend their data and their systems from outside threats, they're not saying, okay, here is my program that I deploy within Germany, and here's the one I deploy within France, and here's the one I deploy in the United States, and here's the one I deploy in Brazil. There's no actually probably will undermine the purposes of the cybersecurity program and make things less secure. Do we think, given this dynamic in terms of the fact that it's a directive and that individual member states would implement it, perhaps with derogations or differences, does that going to result in obligations that differ with inside of the European Union?
I think to an extent, potentially. And right now, what we're seeing is, so basically, NIS2 is due to take effect across the EU in October this year, specifically the 18th of October this year. At which point, in theory at least, these implementing laws that are being enacted right now in EU member states, each are due to take effect on that same day. So organizations will be subject to the requirements from that date onwards. In reality, what we're seeing is actually a bit of a mixed picture, which is consistent with directives, where some member states, those who are more organized, have already introduced their legislation and maybe even finalized it, and they will take effect in October. But there will be some member states where there's delays as well. So we're facing a bit of a mixed picture, and these legislative proposals are still, for the most part, in draft form. So it's difficult to fully analyze the extent to which there are divergences. I think where you can take comfort is that there are some baseline standards that NIS2 introduces, which in our experience, most organizations are currently focusing on, to adopt those standards first, and then see if there are any significant material derogations that increase the standard beyond that baseline that NIS2 sets.
Yeah, and I want to get into what those obligations look like in a moment. But before doing that, maybe we should discuss, to whom does this apply? Or in other words, presumably they're not trying to say that an operator of a nuclear power plant has the same level of cybersecurity obligations as, the stationery store on the corner on Main Street. So are these regulations generally applicable in the same way that the GDPR is, or does this apply to a subset of organizations that are operating inside of the EU?
Yeah. So I guess, with the GDPR, to use that analogy, if you process personal data, then essentially you're subject to the same requirements, whether you're the stationery store on Main Street or you're the nuclear power plant or anything in between. With cybersecurity under NIS2, the standards are essentially the same for anyone who's subject to it, but is only applicable to particular sectors and domains. And those are what the EU considers to be the areas of the economy and the services provided and infrastructure provided within the economy, particularly within the European Union, that they see as being something that could be harmed and cause systemic risks, or at least societal economic risks within the EU if cyber incidents occur. So it includes the kind of what you commonly associate with critical infrastructure, everything from, public infrastructure such as transportation, air, railway, but also utilities, water, gas, oil, electricity power, etc. But those are already included in NIS1 as well. So they're just going to have to, organizations that fall within that scope, kind of level up to the new standard. I think most significantly, the biggest change is the increased scope from NIS1 for digital providers. So NIS1 included a relatively narrow set of digital providers, which was cloud computing services, search engines, and online marketplaces. But NIS2 expands it to a much greater number of organizations, including everything from data centers to providers of public electronic communication services, which includes telecoms, but also kind of digital equivalents of telecoms like messaging applications, video conferencing, etc. All the way through to social networks and content delivery networks, such as those that provide video and audio content. So it will cover the breadth of most digital infrastructure and digital services going forward. It also includes other areas that weren't addressed previously, such as manufacturing, with electronic equipment and or even medical devices being covered. So that will affect the manufacturing sector, the healthcare and pharmaceutical sectors. It includes pharmaceuticals explicitly as well in the context of research and development laboratories. And also an entirely different subsector is managed service providers, where that is also being added. So there are a number of quite wide sectors that are covered by the legislation. But if you don't fall within one of those, then ultimately NIS2 doesn't apply to you. So that's kind of step one in understanding the relevance of this directive.
Yeah, and probably one of the most important steps to get right, because there's a lot riding on the accurate determination there as to whether you're covered or not. It's interesting that to bring a global lens to this is the type of a similar set of issues that we're seeing in the US with the proposed CISA rules that would apply to critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure is defined very broadly and well beyond maybe what a layman would think it applies to. And it sounds like you're in the same position as you're looking at the business that you operate and frankly trying to understand all of the aspects of what you do in your business and then comparing that against these definitions, which were written in a different context. A lot riding on it, and it's super important to get right. And it's also one that's not an easy decision to make at times.
Absolutely. And I totally agree that I think NIS2 is not just a trend within the EU as part of their wider cybersecurity focus, but also what we see globally when we're advising clients is that cybersecurity regulation is an emerging area of law, in whether it's in the US, whether it's in Asia Pacific, whether it's in Latin America. This is a new and distinct area that is separate from privacy laws. And maybe just one point to draw out there, I think, which is really important before I forget, which is I think we already are, many of us who practice in this area are familiar with the concept of, cybersecurity rules in the context of, for instance, personal data and personal data breaches and the requirements associated with reporting personal data breaches. But that's quite a narrow subset of the wider cybersecurity risk that the European Union is concerned about here, which is also about operational disruption and operational resilience, the wider impact of the loss of confidential or trade secret type information from organizations, or the impact that a service being unavailable could have, particularly if it was something such as a utility or transportation, on the wider economy. And that means that the regulation, so NIS2, doesn't refer to personal data per se. In fact, it doesn't make a single reference to personal data from my recollection. But instead, it's focused on the cybersecurity of the information systems and networks, as they refer to it. So the underlying infrastructure, the systems and your environments as an organization, and the cybersecurity of those, as opposed to the security of your data in isolation.
Yeah. I mean, and what makes this area so difficult is that, whatever it is that a regulator were to put down or a legislative body were to put down about what specific types of cybersecurity measures are needed, by the time that it's published, those things actually may be outdated. So trying to be so prescriptive in a regulatory matter or in a legislative matter about what specific safeguards are needed and the level of implementation of those safeguards may end up being a very difficult thing to do and may end up, resulting in handcuffing organizations around cybersecurity. Just interested in your perspective of how prescriptive are these requirements and what is it that organizations need to do in response if you are covered?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that there's a balance to be had here between regulation being so generic in the obligations that it's difficult to understand and organizations to interpret what that actually means for them in practice. So one of the criticisms of NIS1, for instance, was that it used quite similar language to the GDPR in terms of security obligations, saying that the network and information systems must be protected with appropriate technical and organizational security measures. I didn't really expand on that in a great deal of detail, which left a lot of question marks as to what the standard is, which makes it something that's quite difficult for organizations. But of course, at the other end of the spectrum, as you rightly say, there's being overly prescriptive in these measures and kind of handcuffing organizations to a particular type of security requirements, particularly as those may evolve over time. And I think NIS2 in its defense finds some degree of balance there in terms of it's not just being so generic that it's talking about technical and organizational security measures, albeit that's the kind of underlying standard. And at the same time, it's not saying these are the very specific technical security measures that you must introduce. Instead, it kind of builds 5 kind of key obligations, which I'm sure we can talk about in a moment, or 5 key areas of obligations. One of those being security governance, and really kind of distills in a relatively short form list what security governance should look like for organizations, and what are the key elements that it needs to include.
Interesting. What are those 5 key pillars then? That it sounds like governance is one. What are the others?
Yeah, so governance is kind of the core one, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the others are supply chain security, incident response, managerial oversight, and I think that's probably an important one to discuss in a moment, and then also registration of entities with the relevant authorities. So if we start with security governance, like what that requires is a mixture of kind of technical measures, but also kind of the broader governance type measures like undertaking appropriate risk assessments relating to the security of systems, introducing appropriate policies and procedures, having in place incident response plans, crisis management plans, backup management plans that are all documented and clearly evidential, so that there's accountability for organizations. And I think that's a key part of what the EU is driving at here. For those who are familiar with, GDPR, which is very much focused on accountability, NIS2 is very much the same, where you may have perfect technical security measures or close to perfect or very sophisticated technical security measures. But what NIS2 is pushing for is, okay, can you prove that? Have you got the documentation in place to prove that? Have you got the relevant risk assessments to show that you've identified vulnerabilities in software and systems in a methodical manner and then address those? And that's what the expectations are from a security governance perspective. And then linked to that, there's also the second kind of component, which is supply chain security. So NIS2 doesn't allow for you to separate out the systems that are under your direct control as an organization subject to NIS2 from those that you are using outsourced providers to manage on your behalf. So the regulation or the directive requires that organizations subject to NIS2 have to have in place sufficient oversight over their supply chain in order to ensure that they're also meeting similar governance standards. So those organizations in the supply chain may be subject to NIS2 directly, but even if they're not, they're going to expect some kind of flow down here, I think, over time, where organizations need to ensure that the security measures and security governance of those companies is also sufficient. And then the third category is incident response. And I think this is where things become very practical and relevant in the event of a cybersecurity incident, which we're very used to seeing and handling for organizations and are increasingly prevalent. So for a lot of companies right now, the question that commonly is asked in relation to a cyber incident is, has data been in some way compromised? And if so, do we need to notify privacy or data protection regulators, whether that's in the EU, whether it's in other jurisdictions? But this NIS2 and the introduction of cybersecurity regulations really broadens that question to not only do we need to notify data protection authorities, but maybe we need to notify cybersecurity authorities as well relating to this incident, which broadens obviously the regulatory burden, but also the possibility of regulatory action as well. And then the fourth category, which in some ways I think deserves the most attention, is that NIS2 introduces this obligation for senior management to have oversight over cybersecurity measures and ensure that the NIS2 standards are complied with in practice. So it won't be sufficient to delegate entire responsibility to legal and compliance without there being some degree of senior management oversight beyond that. And there's also the possibility although we're not entirely sure how that would look in practice yet, for liability to fall down on senior management where the obligations are infringed. And then finally, registration. So while registration is not expressly required under NIS2, what competent authorities within the EU will have to do is they have to report a list of all the entities that they believe are subject to NIS2 by early next year to the European Commission. And as a consequence of that, what we're seeing and what we're expecting is that most member states are going to introduce a national registry for companies who will be required to register with them to declare that they are aware that they're subject to these regulations.
That's interesting, Dan, and I appreciate the overview. And tell me if my summary is inaccurate here, but it sounds to me that these obligations really are describing maybe process-oriented requirements and structural overall requirements, and less about specific safeguards that need to be implemented by an organization. In other words, they're not going into the level where we're seeing perhaps for like New York Department of Financial Services, where you'd say you need to have this type of encryption or you need to have this level of MFA implementation. But instead, this is around trying to establish the overall frameworks that organizations need to use to hopefully then strengthen their ability to implement decisions surrounding cybersecurity measures appropriate for those organizations.
Yeah, I think that's correct that NIS2 isn't as prescriptive as that. So it doesn't use language which says you must use a certain standard of multi-factor authentication or the encryption must be of a certain level of sophistication. In the context of encryption, what it says is that you must have policies and procedures relating to cryptography and where appropriate encryption, but it remains silent on what that looks like. But I think that doesn't mean that there won't be some more prescriptive requirements going forward. So I think we can expect to see either implementing regulations which go a bit further than that, or at the very least guidelines that are issued by either the EU central body for cybersecurity, which is called NISA, or at a local level within individual jurisdictions. I think it's entirely possible that authorities will say, this is our expectation as far as cybersecurity risk management and technical measures goes. So I don't think it's sufficient. I don't think it would be right to say that we won't have more prescriptive requirements or at least expectations. But certainly, I think the intent is to provide a degree of flexibility, particularly because there is an acknowledgement that what is kind of state of the art, as the EU refers to it, evolves over time. So what is an appropriate cybersecurity measure today may be entirely defunct and insufficient in 2 or 3 years' time.
Yeah, interesting. Cybersecurity is also, unique in that it is designed to prevent unauthorized access to data or systems. And it is an expectation, but only comes into focus maybe externally when there is some sort of data breach that is then announced publicly. Interested in what the enforcement mechanism looks like under the NIS2. Is this something where, there's an incident and then you're going to be subject to an investigation to see whether you have all of these processes? Is the directory and registration process that you described going to result in audits? How does that look for organizations who may be in scope?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what this looks like, I mentioned that incident reporting is one of the key requirements. And basically what that will require is organizations that are within scope that have a security incident that has what's referred to as a significant impact on them or the services they provide to their customers to notify the relevant authorities, which may be one authority or multiple authorities, depending on the circumstances. And they must do that as an initial notification within 24 hours. So it's a very onerous requirement compared to, say, the GDPR, where it's 72 hours. So it's 24 hours within awareness of the incident itself.
So, I'm interested in that, Dan. What is the trigger for a breach notice? Are we talking about an incident that impacts the rights and freedoms of individuals, or is there a different standard that would trigger that 24-hour notice?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the NIS2, interestingly, isn't as concerned as some of the other digital regulations that we see in the EU with just individual risk. This is much broader than that. So it could be, and often will be, a company that provides cloud services, as an example, or data center services or managed services to a number of corporate entities and maybe, let's say, has an outage, that could in itself be sufficient to trigger the notification obligation. So it's not just about individual impact, but also wider economic impact on other companies. So the threshold here is what's referred to as, well, one, there must be a security incident itself, which could be a confidentiality breach, but also an availability incident. So it could be just an outage, which is not caused by a third-party threat actor. It could be an outage due to a bug, a maintenance issue, whatever it is. It could be an integrity breach where certain data has been corrupted due to encryption, like a ransomware incident. But all of those could be security incidents. But in order for it to be reportable, it also must have a significant impact on the services. So there's a certain scale that it must take. And what is significant impact? Well, that is yet to be defined by the EU, but they do have a similar concept, or an identical concept really, under NIS1. And they defined, particularly in the context of digital service providers, a number of thresholds for what that looks like, which are fairly quantifiable to some extent. So there's a mixture of qualitative measures to consider, like geographical spread, types of users, degree of economic impact, but also some really quantifiable metrics around financial impact, around the number of users impacted and for how long, etc. So there's almost like service level reporting requirements. So if you have a security incident, you have a significant impact, that is what triggers notification. And then that must be done within the 24-hour period to the relevant authorities.
So sounds like one important action item coming out of these regulations is that in-scope organizations are going to need to update their incident response plans and playbooks to account for what is maybe one of the shortest timelines that organizations may be subject to.
Absolutely. I think there's both the timeframes and awareness of those, but also importantly, thinking about how your incident response plan is currently configured in terms of informing legal, informing compliance, and under what circumstances, and whether that needs to be expanded, for instance, to cover a non-malicious outage of your service to ensure that legal and compliance consider whether NIS2 has been activated in those circumstances and a notification is necessary.
Interesting. So outside of the incident response plan, what other steps are you seeing organizations take to prepare for NIS2, which I should add, if my understanding is correctly, that's going to become enforceable in October of 2024.
Yeah, that's right. I think step one, and maybe there are four main steps right now. Step one is doing an applicability assessment. So understanding as an organization, are we likely to be subject to NIS2? And if so, to what extent is our business covered by the sectors and domains that are mentioned? But also as significantly, which jurisdictions are we going to fall within the scope of competent authorities? So, are we only going to fall within the jurisdiction of Ireland or Italy or France or Spain, or could we be subject to the jurisdiction of multiple member states all at the same time? So applicability and understanding the scope of impact is kind of step one, I think. And then step two is really kind of breaking down what are the granular requirements within NIS2 and to what extent do we already meet those as an organization through our existing security measures and security standards, and where are there gaps and what remediations do we need to take? And then step three is actually implementing those remediations, which may be predominantly documentation and additional policies, procedures, risk assessments, but actually putting those in place to ensure that you've got clear accountability and a good story to tell in the event of a regulatory investigation. And then finally, it is being prepared, as we've just been discussing, to be able to notify authorities in the event of a security incident that satisfies the NIS2 criteria from the middle of October onwards.
Interesting. If, I'm thinking about all of those different steps that are expected now, are you seeing any particular pain points, perhaps, or at least an early sense of where those pain points reside as global organizations who, have been maturing their cybersecurity programs for years, now to accommodate these new regulations? Where do you see, those particular areas where it may require special attention?
Yeah, I think there's a few. Like one of the really complex issues within NIS2 because of the directive structure that we've talked about is which jurisdictions do we fall within the scope of, but also which entities within our group are subject to the regulations. So you may have certain particular parts of your business that fall within scope, but then the question is which of the companies within your group actually falls within the jurisdiction of NIS2. And that can be a quite difficult but important question to answer. And linked to that is also in which jurisdictions may we need to register those entities within the EU in order to declare that we are subject to this regulation, where they have a registration mechanism in place. And then maybe separate to that, I think it comes back to that balance between being overly prescriptive and not at all prescriptive. And yes, NIS2 finds some kind of middle ground, but with some of the requirements, such as, to use an example, policies on risk analysis and information system security, what are those policies that are expected by regulators? And I think that the absence of clear guidelines at the moment, there's essentially been none that have been issued to date because of how far the European Commission is behind in producing regulatory guidance across all their digital regulations that have been introduced recently. And because of that gap, it can be difficult to interpret what is needed. And I think it's problematic if you're in a situation where this regulation takes effect in October, and then you're having to reassess whether you're compliant with it following the issuing of guidance after that.
So if I'm getting one key subtext here, Dan, is it's almost like for all of those pillars, the theme is document, document, document. In other words, you may be doing all of these things. You may be doing them at a high level, and you may be doing them better than, frankly, anybody else. But if you didn't document what those processes look like to meet each of these requirements, then you will effectively not have adhered to these new NIS2 requirements.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Scott. And I think we already see this trend evolving in, for instance, a data protection landscape where increasingly authorities are much more sophisticated in their capabilities and knowledge of cybersecurity, and are asking organizations, in the event of being notified of a data breach or a cybersecurity incident, what documentation do you have in place to prove what you're saying? So you may say, we've got excellent vulnerability management processes in place, but what documentation do you have to prove that? Can you demonstrate how often you perform vulnerability management assessments, etc.? So that need for documentation flows through from the risk that in the absence of that, it may be difficult to address regulatory concerns in the future.
Well, Dan, I certainly learned a lot. Really appreciate your time and explanation of this new NIS2 framework. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.